I would like to start with a quote, which some of you might know, but many probably wouldn't, from Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, and that about the problems that they are encountering trying to get out from underneath the yoke of the sash window. I don't know, can you all read it, or do I have to read it out? I'll read it out. We have become so wedded to the ordinary sliding sash that people fancy they are suffering under persecution if asked to admit to any other mode of opening their windows. It seems useless to remind them that this fancy is peculiar to Englishmen, or at least only shared with them by the Dutch, and that all other nations adopt the casement. No such arguments avail. The sash window has been registered with Magna Charta, habeas corpus and trial by jury, as the Englishman's birthright. And it seems hopeless to dream of his relinquishing this privilege. Now, this comes at a point where the sash window really has become totally ingrained into English architecture, ubiquitous, one can say. Its origins remained a mystery, but it surely had iconic status, as anyone would try to tamper with that, such as on your left there, Pugin trying. They didn't like sash windows, the Gothic revival. They tried to get out from underneath it, because it was essentially a classical, associated with the classical style, but it was quite considerable and difficult to move. So when I, is it? So do you want to move on? Left, yes. The left one. Oh, the left one. The right one. Sorry, the right. The right one. Yeah. That's fine. I'm showing you this very fine cartoon I found in a journal of 1895. A little bit of a backhanded testimony to the iconic status of the sash window by that stage. It was a little bit, it was part of the family, but a little bit like a problem uncle. It had its faults, but nevertheless, it was there, and it was to be treasured, and for all its eccentricities. Now, the anatomy of the sash window, here you have demonstrations of the full working mechanisms of the sash window, very simple. The critical thing that distinguished the sash window in the end was the counterbalance that was added to that. The adding of the counterbalance, which happened round about 1670, we're not precisely sure about the exact, but it's round about 1670. What it did is actually, it turned this window into a machine, and it was talking about the mechanical sash window, and that's quite right, because what the counterbalance does, it actually allows the window to become of a considerably bigger size. It could be moved, and eventually it really became very, very big windows. It can compete or outcompete its competitor, the French window, at any stage through the mechanism of the sash window. It could be easy to lift up that. I'm showing you this slide, and with the inset of another side of the building on the right-hand side. It is Hall Place, Bexley, and I'm showing you the transitional, say, just from the old building from the early 16th century on the left-hand side, and then the wing that was added, the brick wing that was added in 1649, but with this kind of window, and some of these still remain. And then it became sashed, if you like, in the early quarter of the 18th century. I'm moving on to parallel developments, and at the same time, in the 17th century, in a sense, the development of the window really came to fruition in two formats. The original, what we call now a French window, it is effectively a folding casement, and then on the other hand, the sash window. Those two modes of window came to fruition really at the end of the 70s. I'm showing you here some of the developments from Italy. Here you can see folding casement where the two casements fold on each other, and that was the early form of what we now know as the French window. France, naturally, a 16th century window on the left-hand side there, showing the folding casements, and on the right-hand side, the fully developed French window as it became established by the end of the 18th century on the right-hand side. Similar developments you find in England. In the middle you have the fully developed French window at Hampton Court. And on the left-hand side there at Ham House, you have a window with a cross, the bottom taken out, and a folding casements, iron folding casements in this case, iron leaded iron at the bottom of that. Now, sliding windows existed for a long time before the sash window, but they were not common. The earliest ones I've actually come across are those in Bruges from the end of the 15th century. You can see that on the left-hand side. Here you on the right-hand side, early 15th century, a painting showing what was that time it was quite common, as you can see in the houses in the background there, with sliding shutters. So here you have on the right-hand side a painting of the so-called Merode altarpiece of about 1530. But you can see in the background there, all those houses, or virtually all of them, have wooden sliding windows, vertically sliding windows. And here is a book from the early, a German book from the early 17th century showing different types of slide. So they were known before the sash window actually emerged, but they were not a very well developed window form, but the transition was already taking place by the time the sash window came. Now, the most important route was through France, and these were early sliding, vertically sliding windows in France, and I'm showing you several examples of that. Already by the early 17th century, there were windows that looked very, very much like sash windows. They had top sashes that were fixed, and of course they were not counterbalanced. But here's some French examples of that. In England too, you have, with the slide you've already seen, the Palace House mansion, and it is probably datable, the earliest vertically sliding sash window that we have. And again, the top lights were fixed. At Boughton House in Northamptonshire, you have from Montague House windows that were transferred there from Montague House, and those date to 1678. I think those have since then disappeared. On the right-hand side, a reconstruction of the very earliest sash windows, a reconstruction from that I did from the accounts, the royal accounts and so on in the palace, and this, you see that on the right-hand side, and on the slide in the bottom left, showing you the types of vertically sliding window that emerged in the 17th century, and I refer to them as two types, type A and B. Type A is the one with the cross, the mullion and the transom, and type B is the one that without any transoms on the right-hand side. Now here the typology developed by the end of the 17th century, early 18th century, you already have the emergence of the mature sash window. And I'm showing you some of the earliest examples that you have in the middle. There is the College of Physicians, dated 1674, and you can see the windows there, a model of 1680s. And here is a surviving window now in the kitchen at Wentworth Woodhouse, and this window dates from 1695. And this is the oldest window that were double hung, because that's the point where the sash window really reached maturity, when the double hung action was introduced. On the left-hand side, the slide actually shows you the transparency, if you like, purely the clear daylight through the framework of different types that developed at the time. Now you have the sash window, like all windows, as was already mentioned, is a critical element in the expression of a building, its style, if you like. And at the period sort of just around about the end of the 17th century, you have them coming to maturity, and some very, very fine examples was made, and they formed a very important intrinsic part of the new architectural style, the classical style that emerged. On the top, Hampton Court Palace, and on the bottom there, Chatsworth House, two very fine examples with many windows that actually still date from the period, although the glass perhaps might not follow. By the windows, there's many surviving examples there. Now, it followed stylistic developments. In a sense, it was part of that, or caused it to some extent. I was showing you on the left-hand side there. You can probably term that Baroque, and that's Nicholas Hawksmoor, one of the finest architects of that era. But you can see how he used the sash window as a sort of demonstration of, in a sense, the massiveness of the window itself. They shaped them to some extent, but not greatly so. And then when you move on to the Palladian era on the right-hand side, the window bars are still thick, but now the window has actually been it has been harmonized and proportionized, if you like, in the Baroque proportions were stretched a bit by people like Vanbrugh and by Hawksmoor, but now the window became very much part of the expression of the repose of classicism. The ideal is intrinsic stillness in the design, whereas the Baroque was actually about expressionism and expressing things. But here you have now the window forming part and an important part of the classical style as perfected by people by the early Lord Burlington and those people in the early Palladian period. Now a window has to be able to actually comply and respond to all types of fashion and taste as they develop. And here I'm showing you one of the most expressive periods, the sort of Gothic with a K period, if I can call it that, later 18th century. And I show examples of that where the window was one of the most, became one of the most ornamental parts of the facade, because it was a proposed classical facade, but then within that you could give free play to the window forms and And some very fine examples exist. Extraordinary complex joinery, if you look at how these windows were actually constructed. It was quite serious engineering feats in many respects, but they created some very fine examples that still survive, and I think they probably may be the most fragile of the window forms, and certainly deserve preserving as such. Neoclassical period. What happened in this time is the window became more abstract, and on the left-hand side there, you have Robert Adam at Osterley Park, and at the top there, and then designed by John Yen here. You can see the window forms now cut into the ashlar face very severely without any surrounds. It was a very abstract form, that less so in the work of Adam, but still the window now a part of the design, but a subdued element in it, just a background. In the window structure actually became lighter with thinner bars and so on. So the classical ideal was a window in a wall. It was a single opening in a wall, and that was beginning to be achieved here in the neoclassical late 18th, early 19th century. Victorian period, now with large pieces of glass being possible. So the window actually, in a sense, lost its expressive form. It became a mechanistic element, but with here, for example, in an early 18th century building, classical building here, it had Victorian glass put in the middle of the 19th century. How you can see that the window actually became literally what one can call possibly a dead eye, without any of the proportion of the bars. And here you can see the mood of the light now, but the windows themselves has effectively no. But at the same time, you have the other side, and I mentioned a quote early in the lecture of how difficult it was actually to bring the sash window, incorporate the sash window in the Gothic revival. And here's a very, very good example of how this was achieved by Sir Charles Barry in the Houses of Parliament. These are actually metal sash windows, very finely graded, with openings there, but they slide up here too. So they were integrated very carefully into the framework of the Gothic revival there. And I'm just going to show you some examples from sash windows on the continent. Of course, the Dutch were actually following and close to the English in developing sash windows. There's Dutch sash windows similar to the English ones, but there were structural differences in a sense, and they never achieved or never went to use the larger panes of glass to the same extent in Holland as they did in England. But here you have in Germany the neoclassical Schloss Lyceum and Wörlitzer Park in Dessau, 1740. A very, very fine example of very, very delicate windows now, sliding windows, vertically sliding windows. These were counterbalanced. And then also here at Sanssouci in Potsdam, in the picturesque Gothic styles, here examples of that. And then on the left-hand side, the Dutch examples. The sash window went to Portugal late in the 18th century under English influence. And in Portugal, The Portuguese developed a very independent, but although they were following other examples coming late in the day, but their windows were actually very ingenious solutions they found, and actually they extended the use of the sash window in ways which were not known in this country much. Although, for example, these tiered windows, you do find them in England still, from the 18th century, late 18th century and early 19th century. But here in Portugal, they developed this to a fine art where you have windows stacked sometimes up to four sashes high in cases. And the advantage of that, of course, is that you can open more segments of it. And the other extent is the window structure, when it gets very tall, becomes, manageable sizes, if you like, but also economy. This were a more economical way of doing, rather than trying to make these massive windows that were made in England and in France. You have a much smaller. Portugal was always poorer than the other nations, so you have these economy solutions here. But some very, very interesting examples. I guess, for example, here the window itself is integral part of this, but essentially the expression comes from the stonework around that. So now the old conundrum, invention versus innovation. Here, the sash window was very much part of that. To what extent was it in invention, and to what extent was it innovation? And I've spent many a year on trying to establish exactly who invented the sash window. And my great fear was that one day I would actually come across a note which say that this person invented the sash window on that day, because then all my efforts and extrapolations would be of no use. But here I am showing you some examples of the difference between invention. For example, that is an invention. That is by Claude Perrault, a design by him from about the 1680 to 85 period. And that is a counterbalance window, but he did that knowing the previous invention from England. So in a sense, that is, although it's an invention, to one extent, it wasn't really innovation. Christopher Wren here also invented windows. These are two of his inventions used in this building in Oxford. But the sash window itself was essentially the product of innovation, a continuous period of innovation, perhaps some lucky finds and so on. And for example, the introduction of the counterbalance, which made all the difference, that I think one can probably class as an invention or an inventive idea. It wasn't new at the time, but it was applying something new to solve a problem. And in that sort of sense, that really then made this take off, but it's only part of what the sash window was. Now, the final slide I'm showing you is this about revivalism. Here is Riverside, Richmond Riverside, Quinlan Terry. Classical styles from across the eras, the 18th century mainly, and sash window was an integral part of that. And there I'm showing you, it is still in building construction books, so we're all familiar with the sash window. It's still with us. But if you look at this, for example, the windows are not really playing any part other than having some identification. It was a statement of a period, and the window represents that. But if you look at that, something that will never happen in ordinary towns where you have a continuous development, the windows will not all be exactly the same. Those windows are, I think, all of them really just one batch that was made through, and it was just there. So it was serving a purpose, but it really wasn't an integral part of the architectural development as such. And that the sash window was very much throughout the period, and still is, I think. And the problem I think that we have, when you get to revivals, that's no problem with a revival. You can, copy anything you like. But I think you have to try and develop forms and elements within the bigger whole that actually is integral to that time, integral to the materials, and integral to whatever ambitions you try to express. If you don't do that, it becomes really literally just off the peg, and it loses all its, if you like, integrity as a designed object. I think that's all. Thank you. Oh, yes. So, if you'll pardon me, it's a little bit, I didn't bring it along because I felt a little bit like Moses bringing the tablets. But this is a book which just published a month ago that I wrote, and I've put leaflets out, so in case you want to know all I know about windows, you can find it in this. Thank you.
What's the book's name?
Well, it's quite complicated. It was actually reinventing the window, fenestration practice and theory in early modern Europe. It now is only, after my publisher got onto me, it is now only fenestration practice and theory in early modern Europe. And it really is trying to compare England with the rest of the continent, the developments over a period of about 300 years.
Thank you. That's brilliant, Hentie. Let's do another round of applause.